we're joined again by one of the sharpest minds in firearms journalism, policy, and law, Stephen Gutowski, founder of The Reload and a We the Free firearms analyst. Stephen, welcome to the program. So Stephen, ghost guns have been tied to crime scenes, high-profile shootings, but the reality is most guns are still committed with traditional firearms, which, I don't know how that works into the thought process by the bureaucrats at the ATF, but is this new rule backed by data, or is this really driven by headlines and sort of public emotion about the idea of like, oh, there's these ghost guns that we can't regulate, and if we're not regulating, they're committing a lot of crimes? Well, the stats, from what I was able to find, don't really back that up. So how are they arriving to this conclusion?
Yeah, well, I guess we could just start very briefly with why people don't like these, right? Mm-hmm. Why you hear law enforcement and ATF officials don't like, so why people call them ghost guns, right? And that's just the fact that they aren't serialized. They don't have a serial number on them, which if you buy a finished gun from a store, it has to be serialized, and you have to go through a background check to buy it from a licensed dealer, right? Mm-hmm. The way they sell these, one of the reasons to buy a 80% kit or ghost gun kit is that at that point it's technically not a firearm, or at least before this rule, it wasn't considered a firearm, and so you didn't have to be licensed to make and sell them. You didn't have to go through a background check to buy them. Some people like that because they don't like the government to have records of what guns they have, even though the background checks aren't, there's no database of the background checks. Under federal law, you can't have a registry. And then obviously a lot of people like the sort of hobbyist aspect of building their own firearm. But the other side of that is that when a gun is recovered at a crime scene, mm-hmm. what they'll do is called tracing the gun. They use the serial number to go back to the manufacturer and then follow records down through who they sold the gun to, the distributor, the dealer, then the customer. And they hope at the end of that line, they get a lead that'll go somewhere.
To the perpetrator. Right.
Yeah, they're hoping that the serial number will let them trace it back to some lead that'll end up at the perpetrator. But obviously mm-hmm. in real life, the ATF time to crime report says it takes about 8 to 10 years for a gun from first purchase to end up at a crime scene. So mm-hmm. Usually crime guns tend to change hands a lot. Not always, right? Sometimes tracing is effective. But anyway, to your point, yes, they're not anywhere near the majority of guns recovered at scenes is still traditional firearms with serial numbers on them, mostly recovered. The argument has been that they've increased in number recently as it's kind of become easier mm-hmm. to manufacture them at home with these kits that were at issue in the Supreme Court case. So that has been the big push, is to try and, I guess, at least make it much more difficult to build your own gun at home, which is perhaps aimed at criminals, but also, of course, hits people. I mean, how many?
It's so ludicrous, though, Stephen, when I think about this, because how many criminals are at home? They're like, oh, I need to go to Brownells, or I need to go to whatever, guns.com, or whatever, to get a lower receiver, or whatever the case may be, because I need to build my own gun. I mean, I don't think I've ever read a news article where the prosecutor said this guy was in his basement meticulously building a gun, ordering. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's common. I haven't seen evidence that it's a very common occurrence. The other thing too about the term ghost gun, or just unserialized guns, is the other way. There's another way to get an unserialized gun, which is just by scratching off the serial number, obliterating the serial number.
Right.
And those tend to get bunched together when police report the numbers of how many they've recovered. You'll get both homemade guns and traditional guns that have had their serial numbers scratched out. So, I think that is the much more common way that criminals end up with their firearms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to talk about. You mentioned Justice Thomas at the top of this, pertaining to separations of power, and Justice Thomas, I think, was sort of spot on, Steve, and he was talking about how this rule essentially lets the ATF regulate beyond what Congress has authorized. Do you agree with the justice that this sets a precedent for agencies to expand their authority without legislative approval? Because that's pretty much what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see the court go this direction just because of how much they've tried to rein in agency
Mm-hmm.
authority over the years with
Yep.
things like the major doctrines or major questions doctrine, where they're saying, Congress has to weigh in if there's some sort of major question. It can't
Mm-hmm.
just be the agencies doing, answering all these big questions themselves without legislation to back it up. I will say too, Thomas has been on the wrong end of some of these really heavy splits lately on gun cases, right? Because he was the only dissenter in the last Second Amendment case for Rahimi, and now he's in the 7-2 minority this time around too. So I don't know. It's you kind of wonder where the balancing point for guns is on this current court. It seems it's more around Barrett and Kavanaugh maybe than Thomas or Alito.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, look, I think that's a good point. I mean, this decision is, or some might interpret it as a shift on the court's Second Amendment posture. Do you think that's the case, or is this a narrow ruling that really sort of pertains to administrative law? Some see it as a carve out. Again, others see it as a major pivot. Where do you think this really falls? Because to your point, Justice Thomas is very, very pro 2A, and he has sometimes found himself to be the only dissenting voice, or in this particular case, just one of two, as you noted, Justice Alito being the other. Where do you see this particular case falling?
Yeah, I mean, and Thomas, right, was the one who wrote Bruin, so he came
Yep.
up with the modern,
Which was a
the
major
latest take
major
from the
decision
court.
for us in the 2A space.
Yeah. He's the one who developed the court's current standard for the Second Amendment. I wouldn't say that this case necessarily shifts the court on the Second Amendment, just because there weren't claims of the Second Amendment involved. If you want to worry about that, I believe we're going to talk about this, but I worry more about them denying cert in the latest New York concealed carry case that came out called Antoniuk. That is probably something, if you're looking for clues about where the Second Amendment jurisprudence is at the Supreme Court, that's one that, if you're a gun rights advocate, you might be a little concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, again, from my perspective, I'm looking at the constitutionality of this, and I'm starting to ask myself, Stephen, as I sort of follow these things, are we now regulating intent? Because someone could build a gun, the government gets it, gets to act as if they already have made the gun in totality. And to me, that just sets a really dangerous precedent, because you're saying before you even complete, we're going to regulate the entirety of the process. And that to me is just dangerous, man.
Yeah, and this was a point that Thomas brought up in his dissent as well, where he mentioned that even something like the marketing of these kits according to the ATF, has an impact on whether or not a part is finished or not.
Right.
Which is kind of an odd logical step to take, right? Either the part is finished or it's not. He said, you could have the exact same part, but if it has the jig for completing the part included alongside it, that makes it a finished firearm when you haven't actually done anything to the firearm. And so, that was one of his big sticking points in the dissent. That was something that the majority kind of dismissed. They're basically saying, that what you see here, at least with these Polymer 80 buy, build, shoot kits, and Polymer 80 has gone out of business, by the way, since this all began. So these kits don't actually exist anymore in real life, as far as something you can go out and buy. But, they're kind of pointing to it as, this is like IKEA furniture. This is like a HelloFresh meal kit that they send you, where it's pretty obvious, even just from the name alone, what the intention is here for what they're trying to sell you, and they should have to follow the laws around selling firearms to do that. But they don't give you a whole lot of clue beyond just that kit itself. Where's the line past that? They don't say.
I mean, and that's the point. Where is the line past that? Because I could see future administrations, Republican or Democrat, because not all Republican administrations are necessarily pro-gun, have ATFs that start to regulate other popular parts like pistol braces, scopes. I mean, ammunition. I mean, again, Stephen, I know you're saying that this isn't necessarily a gun case in the traditional sense, but could you see, or could you imagine the possibility of others out there watching this who are pro-gun restrictions saying, okay, that there's a pathway for us to start regulating some of these other popular components, including, again, even ammunition?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as like giving a motivation to a potential future administration, or even in theory, the one that we're under, even though their direction seems to be pushing to repeal some of these rules at the moment. That there is the kind of a green light there from the Supreme Court to say, go ahead and try. And then, we'll decide on it once you do it, and it gets up to us several years after that.
Right.
That's what I would take away. Again, like, they've gone opposite ways on the two rules, the recent rules from the ATF, and it just feels like they're more gonna just decide on a case by case basis.
Yeah. So if you're a Second Amendment advocate, you're covering this as a journalist. Where does this moment sort of put us in particular? It's New York. New York is known for not being, pro-gun, very restrictive, and they have sought every possible way that they could since Bruin to maintain the New York way of life, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. For those of us in this space who are watching this, do you see other more liberal-leaning states following suit? Do you think that this opens a door, again, to other types of regulations? What's next, Stephen?
Yeah, in the Antioch case that they denied cert from today, that Supreme Court precedent, I think, is maybe more noticeable, and also serves to provide, like you said, motivation for other states to try and adopt more restrictions on gun carry. That's what the Antioch case was about, right? It was after the Supreme Court struck down New York's concealed carry permitting law, where they had this very subjective process that you had to go through, and most people couldn't actually obtain a permit in real life. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't have this subjective thing. The Second Amendment protects people's right to carry a gun for self-defense. Then New York instituted a whole series of new restrictions on not as much on the permitting process to get the permit, but on where you could legally take your gun. And so they basically created a lot of new gun-free zones, including like all of Times Square and a bunch of blocks around it.
Which is crazy to me considering how many people move around Times Square. You would think that's a place you'd want to carry concealed, because if there's something that's going to happen, it usually occurs when there's a lot of people around.
Right. So, they really pushed the boundaries on what is constitutional as far as gun carry restrictions go. There's some estimates, the Manhattan, like 90% of it is off limits to carry, even if you have a permit. And so the court deciding not to take up that challenge, that's, I think, a bigger blow if you're a gun rights advocate on the Second Amendment front. Because like I said, this other case, the ghost gun case, definitely still very important and has a lot of implications like we went over, but it doesn't directly address the Second Amendment, whereas this case does. This is a Second Amendment challenge. And, you can't read too much. It's just a denial of cert. Does not mean that they agree necessarily with the lower court, which the lower court ruling was mixed. They struck down what people have called the vampire rule, which is this rule that publicly accessible private property is off limits unless you're invited to carry your gun there. So it's sort of the opposite of how it's always worked, where, if there's a sign posted that says you can't carry guns, then it's off limits. This is the opposite of that, right? And you've seen a lot of states try and implement that, which really diminishes where you can legally carry a gun in those states. So that got struck in the lower courts, but a lot of the other gun-free zones that they came up with, including the Times Square one, are still in effect. So, and then, a lot of their new permitting process, which doesn't quite go up to the line of the old one, but is, playing footsies with it, basically. Good moral character clause is one of the things they have, and they have a lot of requirements on, getting referrals and stuff like that. But the fact that the court didn't take that up at this point is not a great sign. Just, it seems fairly straightforward rebuke of the court's holding in Bruin, right? Like, it's harder to carry in New York now than it was if you had a permit before Bruin.
Which is,
and I don't think that's what the court was trying to get at.
Yeah, I don't think that's what they were trying to get at all, Stephen.
So why they haven't taken it up, that's
I mean, again, as I said in the beginning, maybe they're waiting for the next case to be that next barometer to make another sweeping decision. Hopefully, Justice Thomas is still a part of the court. Stephen Gutowski, founder of The Reload, We the Free Firearms Analyst. We appreciate you, my friend. Guys, Stephen will be joining us once a week or once every other week, anytime there's breaking news pertaining to firearms. Even if there isn't breaking news, maybe some news that you're not necessarily following, maybe you're not aware of, Stephen will be our registered expert. This time he's joining us remote, but we're going to start trying to bring Stephen into the studio soon. We're still making some adjustments to the new studio as we are moving towards interviewing more and more people, but we're excited to have Stephen be a part of the We the Free family. And I highly recommend that you guys go and check out The Reload. Some incredible reporting from Stephen about cases, big and small, going on across the country. A lot of cases that start off small and 3 or 4 years later, it becomes a big deal. And you're like, I never heard of this before. Well, Stephen Gutowski is the guy that will make sure you're informed. I'm sure Michael Singleton. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.